I will take the name Mexican enemies have given me. The whites will learn it, and you will learn it.
It began with a galloping horse, a silver bullet, and a shout that echoed across living rooms in the 1950s. Hi-yo, Silver, away! For millions of Americans, those words signaled not just another episode of The Lone Ranger, but a ritual, a moment when good triumphed over evil, and the Wild West came alive. But behind the iconic mask and the white stallion stood another figure, quieter yet just as essential, the faithful companion named Tonto. Tonto wasn't just the sidekick. To fans, he was the heart of the story, the one who balanced the Lone Ranger's justice with loyalty, wisdom, and calm strength. Played by Jay Silverheels, Tonto became a household name. But for decades, few people stopped to ask, who was the man behind that buckskin outfit? In post-war America, the Lone Ranger wasn't just entertainment. It was mythology. Radio had already built the legend, but television turned it into a phenomenon. The masked man and his Native American companion became symbols of moral clarity, courage, loyalty, and friendship. Kids would grab toy six-shooters, don makeshift masks, and ride imaginary horses through backyards, shouting their favorite catchphrases. But as the world watched Clayton Moore gallop through dusty canyons, it was Jay Silverheels, a real-life Mohawk from the Six Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada, who brought Tonto to life with dignity and quiet grace. At a time when Native American roles were often played by white actors in makeup, Silverheels stood out, authentic, proud, and determined to represent his people with respect. Still, Hollywood wasn't kind to him. The scripts rarely gave Tonto more than a few lines. Often, he was written as the faithful Indian, a stereotype the studios were comfortable with. But Silverheels infused even those limited moments with humanity. He spoke softly, but his eyes carried strength, a depth that transcended the screen. Children didn't see a caricature. They saw a hero who stood by his friend, who fought for justice, who never wavered. Jay Silverheels had turned a supporting role into a symbol of integrity. What most viewers didn't realize was that Jay's journey to that saddle was anything but easy. Before the fame, before the silver bullets and the cheers, he had faced rejection, discrimination, and long odds stacked against him simply because of who he was. And as the Lone Ranger galloped toward cultural immortality, Jay Silverheels began a quieter, more personal quest, one that would define his life far beyond the small screen. Long before Hollywood lights cast shadows over his legacy, Jay Silverheels was just a young man named Harold J. Smith, born on the Six Nations Reserve near Brantford, Ontario, in 1912. He grew up surrounded by the songs, stories, and traditions of his Mohawk heritage, a culture rooted in resilience, pride, and connection to the land. His father was a decorated war hero, and his grandfather a respected chief. Leadership and courage ran deep in his blood. But for Jay, life on the reserve was humble. Opportunities were scarce and prejudice was everywhere. Still, there was something magnetic about him, his tall, athletic frame, his sharp eyes, his quiet confidence. As a young man, he found an outlet in sports, excelling in lacrosse, the indigenous game that would later carry him far beyond the borders of his community. It was lacrosse that first brought him to the United States. Jay joined a traveling team, wowing crowds with his speed and grace on the field. His raw talent and undeniable charisma caught the attention of people far removed from the sport. One of those people happened to be a Hollywood talent scout. Imagine that moment, a young Mohawk athlete standing under California sunlight, being told he could have a career in movies. It sounded impossible, almost laughable, in an industry where Native people were often excluded, mocked, or misrepresented. Yet Jay took the chance. He left home, changed his name, and began chasing a dream that wasn't designed for men like him. Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s was a maze of opportunity and rejection. Jay took small roles, mostly background parts in westerns, where he played nameless Indian warriors or scouts. He was never meant to be the hero, but his presence was undeniable. Directors noticed his natural poise, his athleticism, and his authenticity. Gradually, his roles grew bigger. Then came the opportunity that changed everything. A television adaptation of The Lone Ranger. Jay was cast as Tonto, the masked man's loyal companion. For the first time, a native actor was playing a major recurring character in a hit American show. To millions, it was revolutionary, even if they didn't realize it at the time, but Jay understood exactly what it meant. He wasn't just acting. He was walking a tightrope between two worlds, Hollywood's shallow portrayal of native culture and his deep responsibility to his people. Every time he rode onto the set, he carried not just the weight of his lines, but the weight of representation itself. He would later say in interviews that he took the role with pride, but also with a sense of sadness, knowing how few chances people like him had to tell their own stories. Yet through his talent and quiet defiance, Jay Silverheels transformed that sadness into something enduring: hope. The young boy from 6 Nations had become a pioneer, but Hollywood's embrace came with chains he couldn't ignore. By the early 1950s, The Lone Ranger had become one of the most popular shows in America. Every week, millions tuned in to watch the masked hero and his loyal companion, Tonto, ride into another adventure. For children, they were symbols of good and justice. For Hollywood, they were gold. And for Jay Silverheels, the fame was surreal. A native man from a Canadian reserve was now a household name in the United States. But fame, as he would discover, came with a painful cost. Though the world celebrated Tonto, it often forgot Jay. On screen, he was the loyal friend, the quiet warrior, the faithful Indian. Off-screen, he was treated as second class, paid far less than his white co-star Clayton Moore, and often excluded from the very spotlight he helped create. During press tours and promotional events, Jay was sometimes left out entirely, as if his presence might remind audiences of the uncomfortable truth that the man playing Tonto was actually indigenous. Behind the scenes, Jay faced the ugly side of fame. Hollywood still saw Native Americans as caricatures, stoic, broken English stereotypes who existed only to support the white hero. Jay knew that the scripts reduced Tonto to a sidekick, a servant even, and it hurt. But rather than rebel or walk away, he found small, powerful ways to fight back. He began reworking his lines, giving Tonto more dignity and wisdom. He stood taller, spoke slower, and added moments of quiet strength that weren't written on the page. He turned what could have been a hollow stereotype into a character millions grew to love, one that carried dignity, courage, and compassion. Children saw Tonto not as the Indian, but as a hero. Still, the typecasting followed him like a shadow. After The Lone Ranger ended, Jay found himself locked out of serious roles. Casting directors saw him as Tonto, and only Tonto. Offers came in for other Indian parts, but they were crude, one-dimensional, often humiliating. He refused many of them, knowing what they represented. But that choice came at a price. His acting career began to fade, and yet Jay Silverheels never stopped working. He took guest roles, appeared in Western films, and even made fun of himself in comedy sketches later in life. But beneath the humor, there was pain. The pain of a man who had given everything to a role that both made and trapped him. Friends said Jay carried that duality with quiet grace. He was proud of what Tonto meant to children, but frustrated that Hollywood never saw beyond the feathers and fringe. He was a symbol of loyalty, yet treated with indifference. A trailblazer, yet rarely celebrated. But Jay wasn't the type to fade into silence. He had something bigger in mind, a mission that would outlive his fame. He would turn his frustration into a fight, not for himself, but for every native actor who came after him. By the 1960s, Jay Silverheels had seen the full spectrum of Hollywood's glory, the bright lights, the applause, and the silent prejudice that came after. But instead of retreating, he decided to use his voice. If Hollywood wasn't going to give Native people a fair chance, then he would build that chance himself. Jay became one of the first Native American actors to speak out publicly against Hollywood's portrayal of indigenous people. At a time when silence was safer, he dared to criticize the system that made him famous. "We are human beings," he once said, "not stereotypes." Those simple words carried weight because they came from a man who had lived both sides of the story. But Jay didn't stop at words. He took action. In the late 1960s, he co-founded the Indian Actors Workshop in Los Angeles, a groundbreaking program that trained and empowered Native actors to enter film and television. The idea was revolutionary. For decades, Hollywood had kept Native talent in the background or replaced them entirely with white performers in brown makeup. Jay wanted to end that cycle. He wanted Native people to play Native roles, to tell their own stories, to be seen not as symbols, but as individuals. The workshop became a haven for aspiring Indigenous artists. Jay mentored them, encouraged them, and helped them find pride in their identities. Many later said that Silverheels' quiet confidence gave them the courage to believe they belonged in an industry that had long excluded them. Of course, not everyone appreciated his outspokenness. Some studios began to distance themselves. The man once known as Tonto, beloved by millions, was now seen by Hollywood insiders as difficult. But Jay didn't care. He'd already played the loyal friend on screen. Now he was determined to play the truth-teller off-screen. He also began appearing on talk shows, often poking fun at his most famous role. In one memorable moment, he joked about being typecast as Tonto, saying, "I'm still waiting for my horse to get residuals." The audience laughed. But the humor carried a sting. It was his way of exposing the industry's inequities while still keeping his dignity. Behind that humor, though, was a man deeply committed to his culture and people. Jay returned often to the Six Nations Reserve, supporting community programs and staying grounded in his roots. He spoke to Native youth about pride, education, and perseverance. He wanted them to see beyond the narrow images Hollywood had created, to know they could be writers, directors, and leaders too. In many ways, Jay Silverheels' greatest role wasn't Tonto. It was the one he played afterward, the activist, the mentor, the man who turned pain into purpose. But as the years went on, his health began to decline and Hollywood slowly forgot the man who helped change it. Still, his story wasn't over. His legacy, quiet, powerful, and enduring, was just beginning to take shape. By the time Jay Silverheels passed away in 1980, the world had already begun to move on from the Lone Ranger. New shows filled the airwaves, new stars captured the spotlight. But for those who knew his story, truly knew it, Jay's legacy burned brighter than ever. He wasn't just Tonto, the quiet companion who rode alongside a masked hero. He was something far greater, a man who redefined what it meant to be seen, respected, and remembered. In the decades that followed, the image of Tonto evolved. Critics began to reassess the old westerns, their portrayals of Native people, their language, their stereotypes, and in that re-examination, one truth rose to the surface. Jay Silverheels had done something extraordinary with very little. In a role written as a background character, he created depth, soul, and humanity. He took the limited lines he was given and turned them into moments of quiet power. Many Native actors who came after him have spoken of how Jay opened doors that weren't meant to open. Without his courage, they might never have been invited in. Actors like Will Sampson, Wes Studi, and Graham Greene have all, in some way, walked through the path he carved, where authenticity was no longer optional, but essential. But perhaps Jay's most profound legacy isn't on film. It's in the hearts of the people he inspired. On his home reserve in Ontario, he's remembered not just as an actor, but as a role model. Schools and community centers tell stories of how one of their own faced prejudice, crossed borders, and made history. His humility, his perseverance, and his quiet dignity became lessons passed down to new generations. Even Hollywood, decades later, began to recognize the injustice. In 1993, Jay Silverheels was posthumously inducted into the Hall of Great Western Performers, a long-overdue honor. But his true recognition comes not from plaques or awards, but from the growing awareness that his work mattered, that it was never just entertainment. In a sense, Jay Silverheels' life mirrors that of his most famous character. Tonto was loyal, brave, and often underappreciated, yet without him, the Lone Ranger's legend would never have stood. Similarly, without Jay, the portrayal of Native Americans in Hollywood might have taken far longer to evolve. He lived and died with a quiet grace. But his truth, the truth of a man who refused to be invisible, still echoes today. Every time a Native actor steps onto a set, every time a story is told with respect instead of stereotype, Jay's spirit rides again. So yes, he played Tonto, but behind that name was a warrior, an artist, and a pioneer who never stopped fighting for dignity, and who proved that even in a world determined to silence him, the strength of truth always finds its voice.